I just want to start off by saying that ISRAP is new, but it's sort of just a twist on HACCP, which some of you folks be familiar with. And ISRAP is Invasive Species Risk Assessment and Planning, and HACCP is Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Plan Planning. So I just wanted to go through an outline of what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to define the problem, which are invasive species and their pathways, and then add a solution for that problem, which is invasive species risk assessment and planning. I'll talk about how ISRAP and HACCP are related, and talk hopefully about the and function of ISRAP. I want to define some terminology that we'll be talking about. These terms, non-target species and then target, are terms that we use. The target species in the HACCP planning program is the equivalent of a hazard. And so felt that in working with invasive species, we felt that to change the name, the focus from hazards to non-target species. So a target be anything that you want to move from one site to another. So that would be your sampling equipment, yourself, and then the non-target species would be anything that you didn't want to move with equipment. That would be, mud snails, example, quagga zebra mussels, and then a slew of invasive plant species. Those are just a few examples. So with invasive species, there's a worldwide cost, $1.4 trillion, as you can see. And in the U.S. alone, it's estimated that there's a $138 billion cost. And it's all the second leading cause of native species endangerment and extinction. So here examples: fish, reptiles, amphibians, and others of some of the invasive species that are out there. And there are non-target invertebrates, quagga zebra mussel, crayfish, New Zealand mud snail, China crab, Asian clam. These are just a few examples. There's quite a few others that are out there. Here are some non-target plants: water milfoil, curly-leaf pondweed, salt cedar tamarisk, Salvinia, arundo, hydrilla, and biologics, diseasicides, fungus, bacteria, and viruses. List of invasive species that I pulled from invasivespecies.gov, and you can go online and check this out. But my intent wasn't for everybody to necessarily see and at all these species, but really to just show you that there are a lot of species out there that we're concerned about. So this just sort of gives you an idea of the magnitude of what we're dealing with. Some information about invasive species. Now, I talk about how they get here, and these are the pathways of introduction. And aquaculture, ballast water, and talking for professional activities, for food or seafood or landscaping. There's in each of these. One of the examples that I do like to talk about is the seafood industry. And took crayfish from Lake Tahoe and moved them into Sweden, and some of you know that Sweden loves their crayfish, and they brought them in and stocked them to provide a source of crayfish. And it was not from the Tahoe crayfish, but what I've been told was it was from Turkish crayfish that they brought in, similarly to the Tahoe crayfish. Those Turkish crayfish had a fungus in it. It almost wiped out their native crayfish. So of species removed. And then, of course, with ballast water, there's quagga and zebra mussel. That's how they thought that they were brought over. We talk how they get here, and that's sort of how they're moved from continent. And what we're really concerned with here, in this case, is potential vectors. One species are here, and this is basically some of the work that you folks would be doing. And to note that a single pathway may have many non-target vertebrates, plants, invertebrates, microbes, and others. So now resource management activities, there's fishery surveys, restoration, hatcheries, water monitoring, terrestrial surveys. So this is sorts that are going out in the field and collecting data on the environment or doing work with the environment. Move site and potentially moving species like New Zealand mud snail. Just a point again to emphasize target versus non-target. A target would be down here, left-hand corner, Leah's out in the, I believe this was the Calaveras River, mud snails. And as going from one side to the next, what she wants to move is her tub, her net, her waders, herself. And what we wouldn't want to move would be New Zealand snails or potentially other species that are out there. Another example is fire management activities. It may not apply to everybody, but it's good to note that there is a possibility for moving invasive species around, and we actually have, we out of their resources, they've created sort of best management practices, and they decontaminate their gear no matter what, and they have some really good techniques in place for decontamination that we borrow from. Some other activities, restoration, construction, and utilities. The big equipment here that are in the river, you can see mud that's on the tread there. Well, this ever come from? You know, where last site that it was used in. So there's another potential pathway there. Recreation. This maybe touches most folks on a personal level. We've worked with some folks at USFWS National Park with pathways of visitors to their area, bringing in invasive species and then moving them around. Watercraft and trailers. Some of you know this is how quagga and zebra mussels have been spread throughout the West and the Mist and the East Coast. Big pathways for their movement. And also something that's new, and that's assisted migration. Here's a button that I like to put up if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And I have a solution for you for addressing this, and that solution is ISRAP. So what we've done is we've identified the targets, we've determined what their pathways are, and what we do now is assess the risk of those pathways for moving the species, and then identify, implement, and evaluate their controls. So this assessment, together with HACCP, and HACCP again is hazard analysis and critical control point planning. Identify, implement, and evaluate controls out there, and then risk assessment is there, and together they this, and ISRAP is invasive species risk assessment and planning. Just to give brief overview, history, and the value of HACCP and ISRAP, just a little bit of a foundation. Again, invasive species risk assessment and planning, that's what ISRAP is. It assesses the risk of an activity spread non-targets. It's able to remove non-targets, and that's what HACCP is, and it focuses attention on critical control points where non-targets can be removed. It evaluates these control measures. This evaluating the control measures is something that you may not see in like a management practices. Not determine whether or not the controls that are in place are actually working. So it HACCP, like I mentioned already, ISRAP couples risk assessment and risk planning, which is HACCP. And why are we talking about HACCP still? Well, from the roots of ISRAP, it also is a standard, an ASTM standard, and it's a recognizable brand. You have heard about HACCP. I think some of you have been in trainings that I've hosted before. And ISRAP, invasive species risk assessment and planning, and HACCP, hazard analysis and critical control point planning. So where does it come from? Well, it came from the program, from the space program, and when they said the space program with astronauts going up into space, developed this tool called HACCP, and to move food illnesses up into space with the astronauts. And from there, the food industry decided that it was a really good tool, and they picked it up and have been using it. And some of you, when you're in a restaurant, may see makeup signs like up into the bathroom, or if you've worked in a restaurant, you may be familiar with HACCP. Actually, the regional coordinator, my boss, he was in Bhutan for 2 weeks earlier this year, and he brought a water bottle and a yogurt container, and on the back of those it says HACCP certified. So you see those in the future, or see HACCP as that recognizable brand. So how did it come to be in the natural resources management arena? We developed like nuisance species HACCP, wild bait fish industry. The Wildlife Service developed it after an incident involving one of their culture facilities at Inkster, Texas. So, example, Inks Dam is in Texas, like I did, and it's near Colorado River, and they raise and stock bass in these ponds here. The water that they from for the hatchery has is shad. They stocked News Morgan Lake with largemouth bass, and accidentally moved gizzard shad with that. Were reported in Lake Powell in 2000, they were likely from this Morgan Lake population. And they pressed for the Fish and Wildlife Service. So after years of telling Utah biologists to about stocking gizzard shad and Lake Powell because of concern for sensitive species, U.S. Wildlife Service accidentally did just that. So here's a question of how the gizzard shad moved into Lake Powell. And basically this area right here, the San Juan River, is occasionally connected to Morgan Lake, which is, if the map was extended, it would be over here somewhere. And all it is a hot event, and the two water bodies are connected. So this is how the gizzard shad moved once they were in there. So I want to move on to the 5 easy steps of ISRAP. This will look very familiar to the folks of you that are familiar with HACCP already. Just want to point out a few changes really quickly to identify potential non-targets. That used to be identify potential hazards, so we changed that right there. And activity flow diagram, we changed it to an activity flow chart because it's really a flow chart. And have a risk assessment matrix that we're using, and that may change into a risk flow diagram in the future, and then a brand new decision tree, and then now we're calling the step 4 the on-target assessment worksheet. And then the last, instead of a hazard analysis action plan, this is now the non-target risk assessment plan. So I'm going to go steps, and then we can have some questions. I want to just reinforce for the 3rd time the non-target species and non-target species and target species. And the target species are things that are species that you don't want to move from one place to the next, and would be whatever you wanted to move from one place to the next. So the activity description, this is step 1, and put in, fill out these boxes. It's pretty simple, and there's a management objective here. You would put in contact person, just your name, a phone number, email address, and then this is the activity description, the who, what, when, where, how, and why. Now, it's important when you're put together to make sure that it's sweet but detailed. The idea is that you can hand this plan to somebody else, and specifically the activity description, and they can become familiar with your activity in order to review it or potentially even use it as an example. Some of you may want to take the plan that I'm going to show you today that was created, and it was created fairly recently. That is an example. So all of this information will help you either to contact the person or to use the activity description as an example. And it's important for the next few steps, particularly step 3, where you break the activity description into tasks. Here's an example from the Fish and Wildlife Service Anadromous Fish Restoration Program up in Red Bluff. And he's got a management objective: implement the Anadromous Fish Restoration Program by performing reconnaissance investigations for a fish habitat restoration project planning. And she who, what, when, where, and why in here. And some folks will provide much more information than this, but this is plenty of information. I get an idea of where they're going, the geography, the type of activity that they're doing it, so forth. we're going to identify potential hazards. Oops, not potential hazards. We're going to be looking at non-targets. There used to be another section down here, jumping ahead a little bit, about, and this was information. A lot of people would put in information about from trucks and so on and so forth. I think that we took that because those types of hazards they were in the past aren't really no targets, and they're really more the under maintenance activities. So that would be, something that's very important, but it's really, those are just general maintenance issues. But certainly we're using a particular chemical in the work, or, I talked to some folks that were doing some environmental site assessments, and if those types of works, or potentially maybe even water quality sampling, you may have some concerns about transporting things other than species, and this process would certainly take care of those. But it's important to note here, the vertebrates, invertebrates, plants, other biologics. I went through and showed you a few of those examples. And what you want to do with this is you want to consult local experts. And it doesn't need to be a complete and total species list here, but have highlight species that are out there. So here's that Tricia came up with. Frogs in New Zealand, mud snails, purple life, and just to put none for other biologics. Some other biologics that you might see in here: whirling disease, chytrid, and others. The flow chart. This includes a simple task number, and the description of the task. And this comes from the activity description. Example from Tricia. So I'm going to load her gear. She's going to drive to the site and in that same task, and then she's going to unload her gear. User, which is conducting sampling, reload the gear, ignore it. We have for some of the other plans for folks to actually create a diagram that shows how the activity progresses. Activities can get fairly complicated, especially when I've talked some of the hatcheries out there. And so you would just create a diagram that had arrows going from task 1 to task 2. Now, the target analysis worksheet. This worksheet is it will take your tasks, potential non-targets that you identified in task and for column 1, and then for column 2 from step 2, the potential non-targets. And then is you'll do your risk assessment. And typically what that risk assessment is asking a simple yes or no question, yes or no, whether or not any of the non-targets are potentially significant. You would provide justification, yes or no answer. So that really is, the risk assessment is really this part right here. And then if you determine that there is a significant enough risk, then you develop a control measures here in 5. And these measures could be anything from working from an upstream to downstream. or it could be decontaminating your gear when from one site to another. And then here is determining whether or not this control point here task would be a control point. If you determine that you have control measures, you have a control point. Final call determines whether or not this is the best place to deal with that, with potential non-targets. So the task 1 and task 2 for OSHA's HACCP plan, or ISRAP plan, excuse me. And you can see the title on targets, fish and bullfrogs. She determined that there wasn't any significant non-targets in this task, and that BICE equipment was properly cleaned after the previous survey. And Tricia, and sort of to cut to the chase with the limited time, Tricia that all activities until she returned to the office were no risk. And this was her answer, or that she only goes to one site each day. This is a risk assessment matrix for aquatic management activities. This whole chart here, this flow chart, is not a final copy, and it's not intended to be held to strictly. And what this is, it's a guide to help you determine the questions right here. So what it does is it says if all your activities take place within immediate drainage, that's a yes or no answer. So if it's a site and one site only, and that's the only site that you ever conduct your business at, or you're looking at, then you probably have a low risk activity. And so moving this, Tricia determined later had a higher risk activity, and we'll move on to that in a little bit. But again, this is sort of a prototype. We're not finished with this, but we should have a final copy next year sometime, hopefully. So after we've risk, and I just wanted to make a few more points about ISRAP and risk. The risk, what we're looking here is the level of risk of a task together with the potential non-targets. It's determined reasonable significance of risk, and then you have to provide a justification. So what we're looking at here is the risk of moving into species with particular tasks. That we're talking about here is moving species from one place to another. And whether or not the risk is high enough that control measures are needed to reduce the risk to an acceptable level. And we're talking about reducing risk and not eliminating risk. The only critical control point that Trish up with, and was her task 5 when she returns to the office. If you're back to the task 1, she said that she cleaned her gear. The thing is that she has cleaned her gear. And so the office, because she may be moving from one site and then going to another site the next day. To determine this column over here, we've created another decision tree, or new decision tree. So that a control point is any step or task at which potential hazard potential non-targets can be controlled. And then the critical control point would be the best place to deal with that. I'm not going to go into this into too much detail because of time restraints. So there's her yes column. So now to determine that she's got critical control point here in this task, she's going to go to step 5. And this form is much more user-friendly than the old HACCP forms, we think. And your management objective in here, the task number, middle, targets, measure, and range, limit, or criterion for the control measure. This right here, the prescribed range, limit, or criterion for the control measure, that is one of the sticking points from the past. And what this is really saying is that if you have a control measure, if you decide that your control measure is to freeze your gear from going at the A, you want to freeze your gear. The limit or range here, or the criterion, is that the gear has to be frozen, so it needs to go below 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's something that you would want to put in for the limit or criterion in this section here. That could also be a concentration of a chemical that you're using to decontaminate, or if you're using hot water, it would be that it needed to be over a certain temperature. And you put in a time limit. So if it takes 24 hours of freezing to kill something, you would put 24 hours at 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And so that's pretty self-explanatory. That's who would be doing the monitoring. But the monitoring, this is control measure monitoring. So this isn't necessarily just repeating what the control measure is here. What you're doing is to make sure, in this section, is to make sure that this right here was met. So how to do that? If you wanted to have a line-out sheet, or to check that the power didn't go out, and if the loss pattern wasn't free down below 32 degrees. So checking to make sure that the measures limits were met. It's also self-explanatory. And how often, the frequency, this can be important. To check, the first 12th and 24th hour. And then it is evaluating the control measure. And fallout prescribed range, limit, or criterion. This is sort of a question that you want to ask almost every time that you go out and you're conducting your control measure. So, what was the answer or no for whether the prescribed range, limit, or criterion was met? Something that you want to sort of consider: did the control measure fail? And so, if your control measure fails, you may want to consider a new control measure. So, if you freeze something for 12 hours and you still see mud snails alive on your that is a potential for a measure failing. A correct action would be weapons if the measure falls outside the prescribed range, limit, or criterion, or to fail. So you could put in here to reapply the control measure, or potentially to develop a new control measure. In documents, you could put in decontamination techniques, standard operating procedure, scientific journal articles, a checklist, maybe a management plan. Also, in the next section here, it's also important to teamwork. And one name in here and I'm reviewing a plan, that's sort of a red flag. Work is very important to this process, as well as management commitment. And then the box here for date developed. There's also the box here for date reviewed. So date reviewed ensures that the plan will be looked at. And what we recommend to the folks here with the Fish and Wildlife Service, the fisheries portion of Fish and Wildlife Service, is that they review their plans at least yearly, because personnel change, activities change, these species that are potential non-targets also change, and it also gives you a chance to evaluate whether or not a control measure is effective and reasonable. So I will look at Trish's plan. See? Sorry, I'll focus there. But so her management objectives, Casper, the title, she's going to store the gear, on targets. You see step 2 there also, and the proper cleaning. And she did for her range that she's found, she's going to use a 3.5% solution of Sparquat 2.6. So Trish and Brent are going to be doing the monitoring to make sure that they hit that 2.56, and that's basically what that says. And she's a Red Bluff Fish and Wildlife Office, and after each time she goes out in the field, she's going to do that. Each time she's applied the chemical. Checks anything here yet, because this is the plan. Gone out in the field, she's done this. So those are boxes that she would fill out later. And her corrective action is she's just going to reapply the Sparquat spray, and she's got some links to some documents about the technique that she's using. Trisha and myself were the ones that created it. And it was pretty recently, 8/4/2010. For you. So, any questions?
The question can be sent via chat, or you can unmute and
This is Margarita with Stanislaus County Parks and Recreation. I have a question on the guide to help determine the risk. Was step 4.
Huh?
You had 3 or 4 of risk.
Right.
And my question was, I guess it would be looking for a definition of immediate, what is common, and what is within the same. It's just, what do you consider an intermediate or immediate drainage area? What do you consider a common drain? I'm kind of confused.
Okay, I'm sorry. So, immediate drainage, that'd be, is there a river near you in Stanislaus do you work with in general?
Well, there's
River?
I'm sorry, Stanislaus, San Joaquin, and Tuolumne.
Okay, so the immediate drainage area, this would be like right below dams in the Stanislaus River, like the last dam, right? Do all activities take place within the immediate drainage area? So if you're going to one site area, then you say yes.
Okay.
But if you're going to multiple sites, you start moving over here.
So it's based on where it drains to.
Yeah, well, it would be more if you really truly are only conducting your activities at one site and one site only, you could potentially say that you have a low risk activity. So then, do activities take place within a common drainage area? So, yes, the common drainage area would be, you know, as the Stanislaus River as a whole, right? So they do place in a common drainage area.
Okay.
So any difference in species assemblages between origin and destination. So an origin would be where you're leaving from, and then the destination where you're going to. Or any NTS or AIS within the region, origin site. So you've got Nila mud snails in the Stanislaus River.
Okay.
So if you're jumping between sites, you'll probably have a high risk activity in the Stanislaus.
Okay. It makes sense to me now.
It's okay.
Yeah.